In this video, we're going to be talking about some other foundational theories of second language acquisition. So in the last video, we looked at some of Krashen's foundational theories that he developed in the 1980s that continue to influence the field today. In this video, we're going to talk about the way that others have pushed the field forward, beginning with some theories around output. So Stephen Krashen was principally concerned with input. He believed that comprehensible input, receiving messages we can understand, was fundamentally how second language acquisition happens. Other scholars have pushed back and said language output also plays an important role, a vital role in how we develop a new language. So we're going to look at two of those theories here. One of those came from Mike Long, whose interaction hypothesis argued that modified interaction facilitates comprehensible input. So he argued that when people are having a conversation, speakers make conversational adjustments to make the input comprehensible. So if you're having, if a multilingual learner is having a conversation with a native English speaker, or if you are working with in a world language context and you have a native speaker of a language who's interacting with a learner of that language, that the speakers are going to be making adjustments so that the person who's learning the language can make sense, can understand the input. And so he referred to that as negotiation for meaning. So some examples of that might be they might slow their speech down, they might repeat something, they might simplify the language, and all of that works to make the language more comprehensible, the input more comprehensible, for then the person who's learning the language to produce more output. Meryl Swain has another theory of output that she introduced around the same time called the comprehensible output hypothesis. And in this hypothesis, she argued that language learning occurs when learners engage in dialogue in the new language. And she identified different things that happen when learners are talking. So she said one thing is they begin to notice what they want to say and what they can't yet say. So it is through conversation that a learner of a new language might realize a word that they can't say yet. And now they know that they need to learn that word, or a grammatical form that they can't, a tense that they don't yet know. And they also begin to test hypotheses and then receive feedback about how language works. So not every interlocutor is going to correct somebody's speech, but they might test something out and the person they're speaking with might give them the correct form, right? Or they might test something and realize that the person didn't understand what they said, so they know they said something wrong. So they're beginning to test things out and get feedback for their own language learning. And it's a way to engage in ongoing reflection on the language that they're learning, because as you're using the language, you start to think a lot about the way that the language works and the way that the language fits together. So for example, this is an example of hypothesis testing. A learner might say, he go to the party. And someone might say in response, oh, he went to the party. And the learner might recognize, that was the form I needed. Yes, he went to the party. So that in and of itself is supporting language acquisition, is what these folks would argue. And so sometimes this approach is called a constructivist perspective on learning, right? That we need to be negotiating meaning with other people in order for that learning to happen. Another theorist talked about the role of noticing as being very important. And while this is still a kind of a contested idea even today, I think it has some explanatory power in the way that we think about language acquisition. So Ron Schmidt introduced this hypothesis in 1990, and he argued that learners can't acquire specific language features until they notice them, or until they're ready to notice them. So the example I often give with this is I studied Spanish for many, many years, and I studied it mostly taught from a learning perspective. So in a classroom where I was learning the different grammatical forms and different vocabulary lists, and practicing dialogue. But it wasn't until many years later when I was living in Chile that I was having a conversation with somebody. And I realized when I was thanking them for something that I had been saying gracias para, for thank you for many, many years without realizing I was using the incorrect preposition. It's actually gracias por. Anyone who studied Spanish may also know that por and para, two prepositions that can mean similar things and are similarly used for the word for, can be really difficult for a non-native speaker to learn. I still struggle with those two words, but I remember the moment when I was speaking with somebody and I said, gracias por, thank you for, and then continued for the first time. because I finally noticed that that was the grammatical form that was correct. And it's possible that developmentally, I just wasn't ready in my language learning journey with Spanish to acquire that form until that moment. So he argues that, you might repeat back the correct form to a learner over and over and over, and you might feel frustrated that they're not learning it. Why haven't they mastered that form? I've told them over and over again, it's not goed, but went. And he argued that sometimes it just comes down to when learners are developmentally ready to acquire those features, then they do. So it's important that teachers do bring features to learners' attention, but also recognize that it could just take time. We remember we looked at Krashen's developmental model of how language is acquired, that natural order. Sometimes certain forms you're just not able to take in at the given stage that you're at. And one final concept that I want to make sure everyone knows is communicative competence. So this is a word that, or a term that you learned before, which was a term introduced by Del Hymes to kind of push back against this idea that there was a difference between competence and performance, which was Chomsky's distinction, that competence was the knowledge we had and performance was what we were able to do with it. And Del Hymes really said that competence was much more nuanced and involved being able to use language in context for particular situations. And applied linguist Meryl Swain, who we talked about just a moment ago for the comprehensible output hypothesis, and Michael Canal developed a model of communicative competence that included these different components that they said were essential for the ability to communicate, these different subcompetencies. So they said that there was grammatical competence, which was the ability to create grammatically correct utterances. Sociolinguistic competence, which comes back to context, right? The ability to produce appropriate utterances for the given situation. Discourse, the ability to produce coherent and cohesive utterances, and then strategic, the ability to solve communication problems as they arise. So some of what we were talking about before with engaging in that comprehensible output. So they argue that all of these are components of being able to effectively communicate. So as we think about language and language acquisition, this is a useful lens, I think, for thinking about the different ways that we as educators need to support students to be able to navigate and use language, because it's more than just being able to repeat sentences, right? Or even just the grammatical competence, but being able to use language in these strategic ways and in contextually appropriate ways and in ways that match the given discourse that we're trying to produce. So some important terms and ideas that I hope continue to help you support you and as you think about different SLA theories and the ways that they apply in the real world.